All right, in this session, we are coming to the conclusion of Matthew's gospel. And so we'll be looking at Matthew chapter 27, verse 62, down through chapter 28, verse 20. And Matthew has been telling as a really gripping narrative the story of Jesus' arrest and trial and execution. And here in this recording, we come all the way up to the climactic moment of his resurrection and his commissioning of his apostles. And so we pick up in Matthew chapter 27, verse 62, after Jesus' death. Jesus has been buried, and we ended with a hasty burial, unprepared, and a couple of women watching where he was buried. That's where Matthew left us off in verse 61. And so we pick up with, now on the next day, that is the day which is after the preparation. So the day of preparation is Friday. It was the day Jews had to prepare for the Sabbath because on the Sabbath you could do no work, right? So all the cleaning, all the cooking, everything that needed to be done for the Sabbath was prepared on Friday, hence the day of preparation. So the next day after the day of preparation is Saturday or the Sabbath. So verse 62, though it doesn't use the word Sabbath, is saying we've now moved from Friday to Saturday, the Sabbath. So on that day, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate, and they said, "Sir, we remember that when the deceiver was still alive, he said, 'After 3 days, I am rising.'" Notice that Jesus' claim that he would rise from the dead is so well known that even these people know about that. And so here they gathered together to Pilate to try to address what they fear because of that claim that Jesus had made. And one just really important little detail to bear in mind that is easy for us to overlook, and that's this. They're doing this on the Sabbath, Passover Sabbath. The fact that they do this on that particular day and risk ritual defilement on the Sabbath speaks to how anxious they are about all of this. And so they come to Pilate, they remind him of what Jesus had said, and they then ask Pilate to do something. Look at verse 64. "Therefore, give orders for the tomb to be made secure until the third day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him and say to the people, 'He's risen from the dead,' and the last deception will be worse than the first." The reality is grave robbery was a real problem in the ancient world, and the Romans despised it. And so by appealing to that, they hoped to persuade Pilate to deal with the situation and secure Jesus' tomb. So Pilate says to them, verse 65, "You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how." And they went and they made the tomb secure with the guard, sealing the stone. When it says sealing the stone, it indicates that authorizing that his body is indeed there and that this tomb may not be opened by anyone other than the authorizing agent. So sometimes a cord, like a leather cord, would be strapped around that large stone with clay or wax on each side to say it's sealed, or sometimes maybe just a clump of clay would have been put against the edge of the stone and then with an authorizing stamp to say it's sealed. Either way, the whole point is you seal that so you'll know if the seal is broken, and its intent is to secure the tomb so that no one will mess with it and to know that indeed the body of Jesus is still there. So the tomb is sealed, and they also take a guard with them, and the guard appears to be a Roman guard. 28:14 indicates that they need to be protected from the governor, which would only be the case if they were Roman. And so we have a Roman seal and a Roman guard at the tomb of Jesus. And so you need to picture a group of 4 soldiers, that was the standard group of a guard, guarding the tomb of Jesus. So all of this would dissuade anyone from trying to steal the body. Now, chapter 28 picks up on the very next day. So 28:1 says, "Now, after the Sabbath." So the day of preparation, Friday, that's when Jesus was buried. Then the Sabbath, Saturday, that's when they went to Pilate. They got the guard, sealed the tomb. Now, after the Sabbath, that is on Sunday or the first day of the week. So now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the tomb. Matthew mentioned these two there in 27:61 as observing where Jesus was buried. And so now they come on Sunday morning. And all Matthew notes is that they come to look at the tomb. Mark notes that they bring spices to try to somehow, if possible, finish the burial process. Matthew, after noting this in verse 1, cuts away from these women on their way to the tomb to what happens at the tomb, either while the women are on their way or just before. Somehow the sequence isn't clear, but Matthew cuts away to what's going on at the tomb while these women are on their way there. So here's what happens at the tomb, verse 2. And behold, a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came, rolled away the stone, and sat upon it. I love that little scene because it's like the angel sits on the stone like, take that, death, take that, tomb. I've got it all taken care of. And I think it's important for us to observe this little fact too, that why was the stone rolled away? Well, it wasn't rolled away so Jesus could get out. He appears inside locked rooms in John chapter 20, right? His resurrection body operated by a different set of physics. Now, the stone wasn't rolled away so that Jesus could get out. It was rolled away so that witnesses could get in. And that's why the stone is removed. So the stone is rolled away. This angel sits upon it. Then Matthew describes the angel's appearance in verse 3. His appearance was like lightning and his clothes as white as snow. He's gleaming and bright and white. And verse 4, the guards shook from fear of him and became like dead men. They fainted, in other words. I think it's a little bit ironic. I think Matthew probably told it this way on purpose. Those men stationed to guard a dead man themselves became like dead men. And so they fainted for a moment. And then Matthew cuts back to the women who have now arrived at the tomb. And again, the exact sequence isn't totally clear, but somehow this is all happening early in the morning on Sunday. And when they arrive, there is the angel waiting for them. And so here's what happens. The angel said to the women, do not be afraid, for I know you're looking for Jesus who has been crucified. So the angel greets them, tells them not to be afraid. He knows they're looking for Jesus. And then the angel says these really powerful and important words, verse 6, he is not here, for he is risen just as he said. He reminds them of his promise that he would rise from the dead. And he tells these women, it's happened. He's not here. He is risen. Come. See the place where he was lying. And I picture the angel saying, come, waving them forward towards the tomb and getting them to look in. And he points into the tomb. And inside these cave-like tombs in Israel, there would be a shelf cut into the wall of the cave where the body would be laid until it had completely decomposed. And they would gather up the bones and they would put them in an ossuary. So he points into the tomb and he points to that shelf area. And while Matthew doesn't note this, John does point out that the burial cloth was still there, but there was no body. So as we picture this, you picture the women looking into this tomb, seeing the shelf there and seeing the burial cloth, but now it's empty. You even see the headcloth folded up off by itself. And then the angel says to the women, verse 7, and go quickly, tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead, and behold, he's going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I've told you. And it would have been surprising, maybe even shocking to the original readers that the very first witnesses of the empty tomb and the first witnesses about the resurrection were these women. Why? Well, because in first century Jewish tradition, women's testimony was viewed with very low regard. It was rarely, if ever, used in law courts of the day because it just couldn't be trusted. That was the thought. Their testimony was untrustworthy. So the fact that the very first witnesses commissioned by the angel to go tell the others were women, that fact is noteworthy and important. And so the angel commissions these women to go tell the other disciples and sends them off. And so verse 8, they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy, and they ran to report to his disciples. And behold, Jesus met them and said, "Rejoice." And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. And then Jesus said to them, "Don't be afraid. Go, bring word to my brothers to leave for Galilee, and there they will see me." Now, that little statement in verses 8 through 10 summarizes a whole sequence of things that we read about in the other Gospels. And it's sometimes hard to put it all together because these are all like independent accounts telling just bits and pieces of what happened on Resurrection Sunday morning. Things like going and telling the apostles, and Peter and John then running to the tomb, and John getting there first, and Mary Magdalene coming up and bringing up the rear, and then Jesus appearing at the tomb to Mary Magdalene and then telling her to go tell the others, and then what happens later in the day on that Sunday. And so all of that kind of happens together. Here we just get a brief summary. And notice that they fall at his feet, they wrap their arms around him, and they worship him. They're beginning to see that he's more than maybe they thought, and now he's alive again. Well, then after summarizing that, Matthew cuts back to the guard and what they do. So verse 11, now while they were on their way, so the women are on their way to go find the apostles and the others, they're on their way. Some of the guard came into the city and reported to the chief priests all that happened. Why go to the priests if they're a Roman guard? Because they were stationed at the tomb on the priest's behalf. And they did it as a favor to them, and now their lives are on the line with what has happened. And so they go to the priest before they go to the governor, and they go back to the barracks. So they assembled with the elders, and they consulted together. That is, these soldiers and these priests come up with a plan. What are we going to do? And here's their plan. They gave a large sum of money to the soldiers and said, "You are to say, 'His disciples came at night and stole him while we were asleep,'" which Roman soldiers were so incredibly disciplined, but that's going to be the line. "And if this comes to the governor's ears, we will appease him and keep you out of trouble." So they pay them off to lie and to say you fell asleep. Right? Roman soldiers, as I noted, were highly trained, very disciplined, highly unlikely they would fall asleep. And a guard duty like this, if they failed at their post, well, that usually meant that the guards would suffer the fate that was originally due to the person they were guarding. So you see that, for example, in Acts chapter 12, where they're guarding the apostle Peter, who's about to be executed. An angel breaks Peter out of jail, and the guards are led away to be executed because that's what was supposed to happen to Peter. But in this case, the body was already dead. So, what would their fate be? And so, well, if you come into some sort of trouble, we'll kind of intervene with the governor on your behalf. Verse 15, they took the money and they did as they had been instructed, and this story was widely spread among the Jews to this day. And so there's been this rumor circulating that they stole his body, and this is the genesis of that rumor and that story, paying off the guards to lie about it. Then Matthew fast forwards ahead and gives one last snapshot of Jesus post-resurrection. We know from Luke and from Acts that there were about 40 days between Resurrection Sunday and this last snapshot here in verses 16 through 20 in Matthew 28. And so there's actually quite a bit that happens that Matthew doesn't tell us. So here he just fast forwards to the end and gives us one final snapshot, verse 16. But the 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee, to the mountain which Jesus had designated for him. So in their interactions with Jesus, he had pointed out a mountain he wanted to meet them at. They meet him at this mountain. Verse 17, when they saw him, they worshiped him. But some others were doubtful. And again, we are just getting a very brief summary from Matthew, and so we don't know who some of these others were, why they were doubtful. But the disciples, they worshiped him. And Jesus came up, verse 18, and spoke to them, saying, all authority, not just most, not some, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Don't miss that claim. Here's Jesus, now risen from the dead, saying, I have now been granted all authority. I am the ruler of heaven and earth. I am in charge of all of that. All authority has been given to me. And based on that authority, here is his commission in verse 19. Go, therefore, and make disciples. Literally, it's going, or as you are going. It's a participle. So as you're going, the command is make disciples of all the nations. No longer just Israel. Throughout Matthew's gospel, he has focused Jesus' ministry on the nation of Israel, but now it's for all the nations. And what you're supposed to do is make disciples. What's a disciple? Well, everyone in their cultural context had a very clear picture of what that was. That a disciple was someone who had attached himself to a rabbi in order to become like the rabbi. In this case, the rabbi is Jesus. He's at the center. They are to make disciples of Jesus of all the nations. And it's important in our cultural context to note that it's not make converts. It's to make disciples. The reason that's so important is because making disciples is way more holistic. To make disciples means you're helping people attach themselves to Jesus in order to become like Jesus in his character and in his mission. So that's the commission. Go, therefore, and make disciples everywhere of all the nations, of all the different groups of people throughout the world. How do you do that? How do you make a disciple? Well, look at the rest of verse 19 and on into verse 20. It tells us two ways, two things that have to be done in order to make a disciple. First, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. That's the first thing to do when making a disciple, is baptizing them. And that is immersing. The word baptizing is baptizo in Greek, and it means to dip, to submerge, or to immerse. So immersing them, and so baptizing them, you would immerse them in water. And then it says, into the name of, notice one name, but three persons, name of the Father, Son, Holy Spirit. It's verses like this that led the early church to give the word Trinity or triune to God, that he has one name, but three persons, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So you're baptizing into the name of, entering into union with, into their life. So that's the first thing you do to make a disciple, is you baptize them. And then secondly, verse 20, teaching them to follow all that I commanded you. Notice that. So that's the second part, baptizing them and teaching them, but not teaching them to know, teaching them to do, teaching them to obey, teaching them to keep all that I commanded you. So you're supposed to pass on Jesus' instructions, but do it in such a way that they learn how to do them. They learn how to obey them. That's the essence of disciple making. That's how you make disciples, baptizing them and teaching them to obey Jesus. And then Jesus ends by saying, and behold, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. And that's how Matthew's gospel ends. At this moment, with Jesus assuring them that as he's sending them out to make disciples, he will be right there with them and with us, empowering them, enabling them, sustaining them, helping them, bearing fruit through them, that their efforts are energized by his presence. And so he is with them always to the very end of the age. And with that charge, that commission, Matthew ends his gospel. Now, let me just offer a couple final reflections on this little section as we ourselves wrap up our study of Matthew's gospel. The first is that Jesus, by virtue of his resurrection, now is given all authority, or as the Apostle Paul puts it in Romans chapter 1, he's declared to be the Son of God with power by the resurrection from the dead. What Paul said in a sentence, Matthew has shown in a story here with this claim of Jesus to be given all authority in heaven and on earth. He is the Son of God with power. He is the Son of Man, as Matthew has used that phrase throughout his gospel and alluded to Daniel chapter 7 over and over again. Jesus is now exalted to the right hand of the Father, king over all the nations, as Daniel 7:13 and 14 says. He is now exalted, given this authority, and because of that, there is a specific job to do. Since he's king over the nations, the second reflection really is we need to make disciples of the nations. That's the goal. That's the commission that was given to the apostles and now still is entrusted to us as his followers today, as his church today. We are to call the nations to submit to the one true King of the world, King Jesus, by learning to follow his instructions, live the way he lived, do what he said, and carry out his mission to help even more people become his own disciples. And so Matthew ends his gospel with those two great truths. Jesus is King of heaven and earth, and we are to make disciples on his behalf. And the early church did that. Read it in the book of Acts. They went about to all the nations making disciples. Took them a while, but they figured it out. And the church at its best has always done that. It's made disciples who are learning to become like Jesus by being attached to Jesus. And so may that be true of us and our churches to this day. May we recognize that Jesus is King of kings and Lord of lords. May we live our lives on his behalf, making disciples just as he commissioned us to do. All right, thanks for joining me for this study of the Gospel of Matthew here on the Listener's Commentary. The Listener's Commentary is made possible by the generous support of all sorts of people just like you. So thanks a ton for making the Listener's Commentary possible by your prayers and your generosity. And if you've been blessed or impacted by this ministry, could I invite you just to prayerfully consider joining the team of supporters so that this ministry can continue to grow and bear fruit all around the world. Thanks a ton for your support.